For most people, Hugh Morton is associated with the mile-high swinging bridge at Grandfather Mountain. But for those who knew him best, he will be remembered for his dedication to the preservation of natural vistas and natural resources across North Carolina. I had the privilege of meeting Hugh Morton on several occasions and knew about his famous mile-high bridge, his devotion to UNC Chapel Hill, his connection to Wilmington's Azalea Festival, and about his efforts to bring the battleship North Carolina home to our state. However, just as Professor Elisha Mitchell will forever be bound with the mountain that bears his name, Hugh Morton's memory will always be associated with Grandfather Mountain. Hugh Morton had an extraordinary passion for the land we call North Carolina, but it was a passion born on the ancient crags of the Grandfather. To find out about the origins of Hugh Morton's love of the mountain, I visited with his longtime friend, William Friday of Chapel Hill.
You know, if you really want to know who Hugh Morton was, you have to think back. Hugh was a teenager during the years of the Great Depression, a time that was lacerating in the sense of its impact on all of us as children. And when we got to the right age, here came World War II, and he went off to the Pacific as a combat cameraman and gets the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star for what he did. So when he came home, he was a different person. We were all emotionally much older. But you came home with another part of you that had been refined in all of this struggle. You became very appreciative of nature, and you appreciated what was given us as a people.
During World War II, it was clear that Hugh Morton was drawn to these rocky peaks. Even Hugh's first meeting with his future wife, Julia Taylor, occurred at Grandfather Mountain.
Well, the very first time that I ever went out with Hugh was up here in the mountains. I was visiting his sister. He was home from the Pacific because he'd been wounded and had 30-day furlough and was going back. And I remember that he stopped at a spring to get a drink of water. And I thought to myself that he must have missed that spring so much while he was in the Pacific. It was so cold and so clean and so pretty.
From his earliest years at Grandfather Mountain, it was clear that Hugh Morton regarded himself as steward and not as the owner of this special place.
You know, when people ask you about Hugh, and they sometimes use the word his stewardship, about how he acted or what he did, you know, he never said these things to me, but I've always understood them about him. When he had Grandfather Mountain in his hands as private property, he knew that it had a bigger dimension. It was natural bounty to the people of this country. And he felt some sense of obligation. I'm going to make it attractive, yes, I'm going to get it so people will come, but I'm going to show them that by what we do, we can make things better. And all of this was stewardship. All of it was, look, I know I hold title, but I'm not really the owner. I'm merely here in my lifetime to be a good custodian of something that I'm going to hand on to the next generation, and then the next generation.
Everyone always associated photography with Hugh, even before they associated travel or conservation. Although he got tagged with the Grandfather Mountain ownership a lot, although he never felt like he owned Grandfather. You're just a caretaker of something as special as Grandfather.
Even the employees at Grandfather Mountain understood that Hugh Morton was much more than a property owner. My good friend and Grandfather Mountain naturalist, Jesse Pope, understood Mr. Morton's special relationship with the land.
Yeah, Hugh Morton, on paper, was the owner of Grandfather Mountain, but that's certainly not how he saw himself. He saw himself as the steward of Grandfather Mountain and felt like he had an obligation to do what was right here. And in a lot of ways, he felt like he was doing what anyone else would do, which certainly probably isn't the case. You know, he was really a great advocate for this place and did a lot of wonderful things to protect it.
I'm standing at Cliffside, considered to be the original summit of Grandfather Mountain. It was from this location that naturalist and photographer Hugh Morton could film the real summit of Grandfather Mountain behind me. He could also film such landmarks as Roan Mountain, Mount Mitchell, Hawksbill and Table Rock, and even the skyline of Charlotte. Hugh Morton's lens seemed to capture it all. He was no less an artist than the best painters and writers who depicted the natural world.
Now, you know, when you think of the Audubon prints and all the others that we studied in school, Hugh found out that he could use the camera, whether it's movie or still, and have almost as great, if not greater, impact. And I'll tell you why. When I walked around the side of the visitor center one day with him, and there was that great American bald eagle. He handed me a picture, and I put it up beside the eagle as I was looking at it. And Hugh had captured the majesty of that bird so that you easily understand why it's the national symbol. It's fierce. It says we are here, we're strong, we're a nation. And he captured that. But the scenes he did of the cougars, or that wonderful scene of the deer with their fawns in the morning mist, so beautiful to see. And then he picks up he even photographed a copperhead one day, and I'm scared to death of him even on a picture, but he could capture it. He was every bit an artist, but most of all was his use of the camera to convey the seasons of the mountain. The glorious, glorious color that you could see up there in the fall. And that one picture he had in his book about being out there that morning, it was 20 below zero, taking that icicle scene across the face of Grandfather.
Today we celebrate Hugh Morton's passion to get the perfect shot. But those closest to him frequently had their patience challenged as he sought the perfect light and the ideal moment. Naturalist Jesse Pope accompanied Mr. Morton, the master photographer in the field, and knew what was behind a Hugh Morton photograph.
Yeah, Hugh Morton was, he was a true naturalist in every sense of the word. From the time he woke up in the morning at his house, he watched the hummingbirds in his yard, to the time he'd get to Grandfather Mountain and pay attention to, the pink shell azaleas starting to bloom, or the catawba rhododendron. He always knew exactly the timing of those plants because he watched them every day. Well, I was lucky enough to be out in nature with Hugh Morton several times on several different occasions, and I always was amazed at his patience and his just drive to get the right shot. He knew what he was looking for. When he went out there, he knew exactly what he was looking for in a picture before ever stepping foot in the forest. He had that vision of what he wanted, and I remember several times we went on expeditions to get pictures of Shortia, Oconee bells, and it was really, really such a neat treat to go down there and watch him spend hours on hours trying to get the right shot. And we would literally sit in the woods, with the cameras set up, the tripods set up, and staring at the clouds, waiting to get that right cloud cover for the perfect lighting to snap that picture. And it was then that I realized, just how much there really was behind a Hugh Morton photo.
No one's patience, however, was tested by Hugh Morton's search for the perfect photograph more than that of his wife, Julia Morton.
He stayed there 7 hours waiting for that sun to give him the shadow that he wanted. And I sat in the car and I finished the book I had, and then I read the road map, and then I read, and then when he got back in the car, he said to me, "I don't see why anybody can be in the most beautiful place in the world and read a book." Sometimes it took all the grace you had to put up with him taking a picture.
Morton's love of the mountain, reflected through his stewardship and photography, expanded as he sought to protect the face of the grandfather.
If you've ever been up there and driven down the highway system from Linville back toward Blowing Rock and all, you don't see the face of the mountain scarred. Now that came about because of his fight over the Lynn Cove Viaduct, which is, incidentally, was an architectural award-winning idea when it was built. This was pure Hugh Morton. He was saying to you, wake up. You've got something here that you owe your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren and every citizen in this state.
Hugh's grandson, Cray Morton, the president of Grandfather Mountain, remembers his grandfather's passion to preserve the visual integrity of Grandfather Mountain and of surrounding peaks.
We all know the Lynn Cove Viaduct. You can't see a brochure or a television commercial of Visit North Carolina without having an image of the viaduct. It's a beautiful S-curved road that hugs the side of Grandfather Mountain and has been revered and appreciated by visitors and citizens of the state for over 20 years now. Now this special piece of road was an engineering marvel, but also a marvel as a spectacle. And this is what drove my grandfather, the visual elements to the mountain. Now he didn't design the viaduct, but the viaduct arrived indirectly from his efforts in battling the parkway to maintain a lower route for the parkway as it went through Grandfather Mountain. This would keep it from the mountaintops, which would ruin the view of the mountain, and in his photographs and the way that he loved it and wanted other people to love and appreciate it when they looked upon it.
Hugh Morton did not believe that large structures should replace or interfere with natural ridgelines. His flair for the visual led him to champion state laws that protected mountain vistas for future generations.
My grandfather was one of the people that helped spearhead the Ridge Law, which is an important piece of legislation for the state of North Carolina and certainly for the mountain area. This legislation prevents construction beyond certain limitations on the ridgelines here in the North Carolina mountains. And one of the main reasons that my grandfather was such a proponent of this was his flair for anything visual, for anything that he felt was beautiful or stunning. And he knew the ridge lines as he saw them naturally when he was a child coming up, and he wanted to retain those. And he wanted to be able to photograph them, and he wanted people to be able to see the same beauty that he saw for all his life. And so he pushed ahead along with some other good people in the state to put this legislation in place, and a lot of us are enjoying it now, not for what we do see, but for what we don't see.
Although Hugh Morton fought to preserve natural vistas, there was no stronger proponent of development and tourism in North Carolina.
And he was never against progress or development, so to speak, in the ways that a lot of people these days think about it. But he was always for balance. He would serve on various tourism boards and committees and Chamber of Commerce type organizations that wanted to bring business and roadways into North Carolina. But he wanted to do it the right way. And that was one of the lessons he never tried to teach, but he taught through example, which was you can have both. You just have to think in advance and make responsible decisions.
In Hugh Morton's fight for clean, unobstructed mountain vistas, his attention inevitably turned to clean air. In this fight, he pulled no punches. Morton enlisted the help of friends across North Carolina and the nation to sound the alarm about air pollution. In 1995, Morton photographed and produced The Search for Clean Air, an award-winning PBS documentary narrated by Walter Cronkite.
We know that one common factor, air pollution, links areas where trees die, where waters and soils acidify, and where people suffer unexplained respiratory stress. And we know that we can clean our skies. We can meet and surpass the toughened standards of the Clean Air Act. We have the know-how, we have the technology. The question is, How long can we afford to wait?
Morton's fight for clean air and unmarred vistas was not just out of concern for the perfect photographic image, but it was also out of knowledge and concern for the great biodiversity at Grandfather Mountain and on surrounding peaks.
Grandfather Mountain is one of the most biologically diverse mountains east of the Rockies, probably in the world. We have more plant species that occur here than the entire continent of Europe. We also have a number of interesting rock formations because of the rock types that occur here. And that's where we get our name from, is from some of those interesting rocky outcrops. And a number of watersheds also occur here. We have 72 bird species that nest here. We have 14 species of salamanders that occur in the park. And we also have 29 globally imperiled species that occur here. Grandfather Mountain is an international biosphere reserve, which is a place of ecological significance that also is open to the public and has ongoing education and research.
Hugh Morton's efforts to protect mountain landscapes also took on a very practical dimension in the form of legal easements. Mike Leonard of Winston-Salem, one of North Carolina's best-known conservation lawyers, helped me to understand the importance of the easements protecting Grandfather Mountain and how Mr. Morton's easements were models for others to follow.
Mr. Morton put the most restrictive kind of easement up there that there is. No timber cutting, no houses, no roads, no development, no new buildings. The trails could stay there and people could use the trails, but because of the incredible beauty of Grandfather Mountain and because of the amazing natural diversity up there, I mean like rare plants everywhere, the easements done up there were the most restrictive you can do. In the early 80s, you didn't see many easements. They really there weren't that many of them being done. People kind of talked about them. But by the late 80s, they really started becoming a real important tool. And something that was very important about what Mr. Morton did here was because Grandfather Mountain was so well known. I mean, let's face it, it's one of the most best known places in the state, best known places in the Southeast. It's known all over the country, actually. Those easements, because they were there, kind of served as an incredibly good model to educate others as to what easements meant and how they worked.
If you have a unique parcel of land which you believe should be protected by an easement, Mike had some suggestions about where to get help.
The most important benefit of easements, and this is especially true for people who love their land, is peace of mind. It's peace of mind knowing that that land will stay the same. But then there are other benefits beyond that. There are tax deductions, there are tax credits. You can get reductions in your property taxes, but you've really got to start out with the desire for that peace of mind. If you're talking about farmland, open land, probably the best place to go would be one of your local land trusts, like the Piedmont Land Conservancy in this area, the Land Trust for Central North Carolina, the Triangle Land Conservancy, the Coastal Land Trust. Now, if you're talking about larger natural areas, there are groups like the Nature Conservancy, the Conservation Fund, which is a large national group, very successful group, the Trust for Public Land. Now, if you want to find out who the local land trust in your area is, there's a group in Raleigh called the Conservation Trust for North Carolina that can provide you with that information.
Legacy is a powerful term and often overused. Few naturalists, however, few people have a more tangible legacy than Hugh Morton.
In the mountains, Mr. Morton's legacy is there. We can go see it, we can go walk on it, we can go enjoy it. There's Grandfather Mountain, of course, we've talked about that. When he was involved in the Year of the Mountains Commission in the mid-1990s, that's when I really first got to know him, 95, 96. He really pushed for the idea of getting the state of North Carolina more involved in protecting lands along the parkway. He pushed to get greater federal support for it. And since that time, there's been 27,000 acres protected along the parkway, ranging from the 17,000 acre Asheville watershed easement to smaller tracts, some as small as 10, 15 acres. In a way, in fact, in more than a way, all those 27,000 acres are part of Mr. Morton's legacy to us.
In 2008, Hugh Morton's passion for the land, and especially for Grandfather Mountain, was carried to a fitting conclusion when 2,600 acres of the mountain's crest and backcountry trails were acquired by North Carolina to become the state's 34th state park. When you see this mountain, with its rare plants and animals, know that it is inextricably bound to the passion and stewardship of one man. But Hugh Morton's legacy is more than the mountain, a park, an unparalleled collection of photographs, and numerous awards and honors. It is a legacy best articulated by his close friend, William Friday.
If you were to ask me what Hugh's legacy is to all of us and to those who are going to follow us for 100 years, it would be this. I think he taught us all that when you have been given a natural endowment, as he was with Grandfather Mountain, you understand that you are just a figure in the passage of time. But your job is to make it better, or to preserve it, or to enrich it, or to interpret it so that people will really understand what is there, and it's such a rich blessing. Now Hugh, from Grandfather Mountain, broadened that notion, and his legacy really is that he felt that way about his state and all the institutions in it. He loved the university. He gave it everything he had, including his photographic collection after his death. But his legacy was, understand that you're here to be a public servant. You're here to preserve what nature has given and enrich it. You're here to teach school. You're here to make the world a better place. And I don't think I ever once heard Hugh be bitter about anything. He didn't have time for that. His time was to move. Let's get on with what we're here to do. And every once in a while, he would sort of nudge you and say, are we doing all we can do? But let me tell you, there were few human beings that loved God's creation the way he did, whether it was the birds that flew, the animals that were there, or the fish that swam, or the mountains themselves. He saw it as an integration for the better life, and he saw his job as one of making that, in his time, as rich as he could. That was Hugh Morton's legacy as I know it.